Hey, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. My name is Stella and I make videos talking about today's technology and tutorials on how we can use them. Today we'll be going over for loops and nested loops in Java, so let's get started. Loops are basically repeating statements based on the conditions that you have set. This is useful so instead of copying and pasting your statement multiple times, you would only need to write your statement once and the loop will repeat the statement however many times you set it. Just to note, whenever you're creating a loop, you should have a variable inside the loop that will be updated and checked every time before the loop is executed. This will prevent a forever running loop. Let's first look at for loops. For loops are great when you know how many times you want to repeat a block of code. How it works is that it has a counter that keeps track of the amount of times the loop has iterated. Usually we set this counter to 0. Then we check if it meets the condition. If it is true, then it will execute the block of code and increase the counter by 1. If the condition is false, then the for loop will terminate. For example, if we want to find the sum of 10 consecutive numbers starting from 0, we will first make a main method and initialize an integer called sum equal to 0. Then we can start the for loop and set the integer I, which is going to be our counter, equal to 0. Set the condition where I is less than 10. And I++ means that the counter will increment by 1 every iteration. Lastly, we're going to finish off the for loop with curly brackets. Inside the for loop, we will set sum equal to sum plus I, and this will add to the previous sum with the next consecutive integer. Then we'll do a print statement of sum to see the sum being increased every iteration. Lastly, we will do another print statement outside the for loop of total sum, and we'll add sum. Now when we run this Java program, and we get this output, our first sum is 0, and that makes sense because at first we initialize sum to be 0 and I to be 0, therefore 0 plus 0 would be 0. However, I is incremented by 1 after the first iteration. Therefore, sum is 0, however, I is 1. So 0 plus 1 is 1, and that's why we get 1 here. Next, since sum is equal to 1 and I is equal to 2 now because we iterated through the for loop and it incremented by 1 again, 1 plus 2 is 3. Therefore, we get 3, and so on. We can see at the end our total sum is 45. Another use for the for loop is to iterate through values in an array. So let's first initialize an integer array by going int array, and we can set the values to 2, 5, 17, 32, and 45, and then close it off with a semicolon. Without a for loop, we would have to manually type out 5 print statements to print out all 5 elements of this array. Then it would look something like this. System out print an array at index 0, and then we will copy and paste this 5 more times. And then change the index and run this program. Even though it gives us the 5 elements of the array, it doesn't look too clean. So let's use a for loop to do the same thing. So what we will do is create a for loop and set the counter integer I equal to 0. Then I will be less than array.length, which is the length of the array, and then I++, which will increment the I every iteration. We will finish off the for loop with curly brackets, and inside the for loop, we will just have one print statement, and it will be array at index I. So let's give this a run. We can see that the 5 output here was our first 5 print statements, and then the next 5 outputs was only from our 1 print statement. What this for loop does is that it will start at array at index 0, and that is 2. Then after the print statement, I will increment by 1, and then it will print out array at index 1, which is 5, and so on. Another way to do this exact same thing is with a for each loop. For each loops are great when you want to iterate through elements in an array without knowing the exact amount of elements. To create a for each loop, it is very similar to a for loop. We will first delete the 5 print statements, and before the for loop we will have a print statement just to indicate that it is a for loop. Then after the for loop we will have another print statement, and this will be a for each loop. To make a for each loop, we will first start with a for loop, and we will create an integer called num. Then we will have a colon, and then we'll reference the num to the array. Lastly, we will finish this for each loop off with curly brackets. Then inside the for each loop, we will do a print statement of num. So these few lines of code means that for each integer num in the integer array, it will print out the num. That way we don't have to keep track of how many elements in the array. This for each loop will run until there is no more elements in the array to iterate through. When we run this program, we can see that our for loop has the same output as our for each loop. The next loop we're going to look at is the nested loop. A nested loop is basically a loop inside of a loop and used to iterate through two-dimensional arrays. The arrays we have previously referenced were only one-dimensional arrays. A two-dimensional array is used to store values in a grid-like form. In this picture, we can see that the grid has rows and columns. To make this grid into a 2D array, we will initialize an integer array like this, and then each row of the grid should be in its own curly brackets. So in the first row, we have 1, 2, 3, and then comma and move on to the next row, 4, 5, 6, comma, 7, 8, 9. And then finish it off with a semicolon. So how are we going to iterate through a two-dimensional array? We are going to be using two for loops. The first for loop is in charge of iterating through the rows. The second for loop is in charge of iterating through the columns. So we will start with our first for loop, set integer I equal to 0. I is less than 3 because we only have 3 rows, and I is incremented by 1, and curly brackets. Then we'll create a second for loop that will take care of our columns, so integer j now is equal to 0. J is less than 3 because there are 3 columns, and j is incremented by 1, and finish that off with curly brackets too. Now we can start playing around with our nested loop. For example, if we want to print out row by row, we can go up here and do a print statement of row plus I. So this will give us a counter of what row we are at. And then in our second for loop, we will do a print statement of array at I and at j when we run this program, and we get this as an output. So in our first row, it's 1, 2, 3, which matches the grid. Then in our second row, it's 4, 5, 6, and our third row is 7, 8, 9. And this is just one of the many ways we can play around with nested loops. For instance, if we want to print out column by column, we'll go up here and change this to column, and then go down to the array and switch the j and I variables. And then when we give this another run, we can see that in our first column, it's 1, 4, 7, which is the same as the grid, then 2, 5, 8, and then lastly 3, 6, 9. And that concludes this week's video on for loops and nested loops. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you were able to follow along and learn some cool new things. If you liked this video, make sure to give it a big thumbs up. I make videos like this every single week, so if you like what you see, please subscribe to my channel. Also, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future tutorial videos, please make sure to leave them down in the comment box below. Other than that, thank you again for watching my video, and I'll see you next week.